and I'm on that camera. Can you see me okay on Zoom?
Yes, we can.
We can. Good evening, everybody. Good evening to our elite audience here live. And good evening to everybody joining us on Zoom. We have a really excellent classic anthropology fieldwork talk tonight with my colleague Mark Jamieson, who spent a long time with me teaching on the degree course at University of East London. Mark's got many years of fieldwork experience with the Miskitu communities at Caribbean, Nicaraguan coast. And he's got a sort of in-depth case study of the ways that kinship is being changed in modern contemporary circumstances. But before Mark was going to start, I was going to invite Chris to say something about the importance of this issue of shifts from matrilineal or matrilateral tendency in kinship towards patrilineal tendency. Chris, do you want to say something about that?
Yes, well, when anthropology was first established as a discipline in the 19th century, in the 1870s, 1880s, and right up until about 1920, right from the beginning, really everybody agreed that early human kinship was likely to have been matrilineal, and that all human societies, if they're in transition, the direction of transition just about everywhere would be from essentially matrilocal and matrilineal kinship, increasingly over time to patrilocal and patrilineal kinship. And that was just because no one had ever seen really or recorded an example of change in the opposite direction. It's very unusual to find a society which is patrilocal, patrilineal, shifting over to matrilocal and matrilineal, although one or two examples have been claimed and perhaps they're genuine. But what happened was that when this was first, kinship was founded by, as I think everybody probably knows, by an American business lawyer called Lewis Henry Morgan, looking at kinship systems across North America. And he argued that early human kinship was not just matrilineal, but in important ways collective. He talked about communism in living. He talked about the fact that women would tend to live with their own mothers, that groups of sisters would share the childcare. And the very idea that this was kind of some form of communism was central to his theory. This was adopted by Frederick Engels as kind of part of communist doctrine. And that was the problem, really, because of course, what it meant was that it got embroiled in all the issues about politics. And when in the 20th century, Professor Malinowski established a different way of looking at culture and history, he denounced the whole idea that it's even conceivable that a child could have more than one mother. He insisted that the fundamental human social structure and social order depended on the nuclear family headed by a man, marriage being the primary institution. And at that point, it became right across anthropology just impossible to even claim that there's anything other than just the odd incidents of transition from matrilineal to patrilineal, and that any society was just as likely to go in the reverse direction. So it actually turns out now that probably the early theorists were correct. There are very good reasons why, for hunter-gatherers, a woman would want to live with her mum. That means that when she gets pregnant and needs support, she's got a mum to support her. And we now know that actually, at least initially, among hunters and gatherers, and of course we were all once hunters and gatherers, living with mum was the kind of the choice that most women would tend to make. Where you live would tend to be pretty, much up to individuals, but basically women would prefer to be with their mum in the early years of their relationship with a guy in order to have that necessary help in childcare. And that links up with what's called the grandmother hypothesis as part of human evolution with Sarah Hrdy's ideas about shared childcare. And so what's happening now is that we're having a talk about a particular example. And I just wanted to stress that although this is an extremely interesting example, we need to put it in a wider context. It might seem it's in a rather unusual case that we have this, what Mark's, I think, going to be talking about a transition, but actually this transition is of a kind which we find right all over the world. So it's a particularly interesting case study of a much more general trend in long-term history of kinship. Sorry.
Thank you, Camilla, for the introduction, and thank you, Chris, for that extremely cogent and clear account of where matrilineal descent sort of fits into the conversation of conversation surrounding kinship and social organisation and small-scale societies. As Chris was saying, that this is only but one example of what a society that might be called matrilineal looks like, and in some ways it may be perhaps atypical in the sense that the kind of kinship that the founding fathers and mothers of anthropology were interested in were primarily hunter-gatherer societies, and Miskitu are not hunter-gatherers, that they hunt, but they're primarily hunter horticulturalists that practice slash and burn farming, and they're also fishermen, and in that sense that they're perhaps rather different, but at the same time a lot of what constitutes what have called the politics of intimacy, which is political processes surrounding domestic organisation, relationships, sexual relations, and so forth, is very much like those that have been described for hunter-gatherer societies. Right. I want to talk, first of all, a little bit more, follow on from where Chris was, and talk a little bit about this particular style of kinship, which is, I think, is characteristic, or the literature tells us, is characteristic of small-scale societies, of hunter-gatherer societies, or foraging societies in particular, but it's also quite common amongst some slash and burn or swidden horticulturalists as well, of which Mosquito one example. And this is a style of kinship which is known as bride service. Bride service is a style of kinship, is a way, put simply, the way by which conjugal unions are legitimated. I call them conjugal unions because I don't really want, I feel slightly uncomfortable about describing them as marriages, because the way that conjugal unions actually work, if you like, is actually quite different. And one thing about bride service is that bride service, put very crudely, in the past, the difference between bride wealth and bride service was cast as follows: that bride wealth involved a transfer of property from the groom to, or prospective groom to, the bride's kin, whereas that was bride wealth, whereas bride service was actually involved the groom giving labour instead of property to the bride's group. So the difference was whether it's in terms of labour or property, but the direction of travel of goods or services was essentially the same, that it came from the groom's group to the bride group. So it's very different, for example, from dowry, which is found in a lot of places like northern part of South Asia and Europe, where dowry involved prestations or gifts or property or whatever going from the bride's group to the groom's group. This is, in fact, bride wealth and bride service were different to both of those. I mean, so far as they involved, this is what the idea was, they involved property or services going from the groom's group to the bride's group. In the sense, you were either some people put it that they were buying the bride, or buying the bride's labor or services or procreative powers or whatever. But in fact, there are differences between bride wealth and bride service, which are kind of quite substantial, and they are really rather different kinds of kinship. So they produce different kinds of political processes or micro-political processes in the communities where these ways of legitimating marriages or conjugal unions, more strictly speaking, have the way that they work. So perhaps one way to look at that is if we look at the difference between them. So bride wealth, as it's classically described, involves gifts or prestations from the groom's kin to the bride's kin, yeah? And it's typically, so that's the classical description of it. It's typically found in, or not exclusively, but it's typically found in amongst groups of people where you have patrilocal postnuptial residence, and what that means is that the bride goes and lives with the groom's group, and so forth. And what you have is in where you have bride wealth, that typically this involves transfers of property, like movable property, such as livestock, such as cattle and pigs, are given, and there's part of the bride wealth, and therefore the groom, in order that he owes the fact that he has now had a conjugal partner to his own kin. They've provided him, because young men typically don't have very much wealth, so they get their wealth from, in this model, they get their wealth from their fathers and their grandfathers and their paternal uncles, people who are in their particular patrilineal group. They'll get this property and they'll transfer it to the bride's kin, and therefore the groom owes the fact that he's married to his own senior members of his own group. So the debt is, if you like, for him getting married, for having a wife and all that, is vertical up, if you like, the lineage towards senior elders. So it's a debt which is vertical. That's so vertical debt to senior agnates. Agnates is just a posh word in anthropology for people in the same patrilineal group. Yeah. So now bride service, which some people have conflated with bride wealth, insofar as it seems that the property is going from the groom's group to the bride's group, is completely different. It works on a completely different logic. Whereas bride wealth is typically found in societies which have those kind of movable wealth. They have kind of forms of movable wealth that serve as a kind of currency, and things like cattle or pigs and other forms of currency can work in that kind of way. Where you find them is societies with cattle, so you find it very often amongst pastoralists. So people like the Nua, the Lebedu in Africa. You find them about in Papua New Guinea, the Melpa, whom pigs are very important. And these are all peoples where patrilocal. What I mean by patrilocal is that the bride moves to the groom's group. Those kind of things are very important. So this bride wealth, this, as I've described it, this the kind of, if you like, the model of kinship, if we can use that bracket. Let's not talk about whether kinship exists or not. That's something for another day. But if we can bracket the fact that maybe I'm reifying the concept of kinship, that's if you like, the model of kinship that works in those kind of societies. So bride service, though, as I said, is something which is very difficult and is very typically found in groups such as the hunter-gatherer foraging societies, in some Swidden horticulturalist groups, where you don't have plough agriculture where land is important, but where you have shifting cultivation and grow things like cassava and things like that. So you find it in amongst peoples like Kung, who are a foraging group in southern Africa, the Murngin, who are people in Australian Aboriginal people, the Ilongot, who are foragers, hunter horticulturalists in the Philippines, the Urarina, who are Swidden horticulturalists in Peru, and the Mosquito, about whom I'm going to talk. So what you find in this kind of style of kinship is a style is a bride service, and this is it's so instead of property coming from the groom's group, and that actually legitimates, if you like, the conjugal union. But what you find in bride service types of groups is that you find you find prestations not from the groom's kin, but just from the groom himself. It's just the groom himself. The groom cannot expect any help for the legitimation of his conjugal union. He can't expect any help from his members of his own group. Sorry, Chris. Did you have your hand up? Or?
Not at all, no.
Oh, sorry. Just...
Keep your hand down.
So I did. I just wondered where are the long lots from?
Philippines.
Philippines, okay.
Yes. Okay. So you have a different style of kinship, and again, some people have argued that the people using the term kinship have verified that term. So I don't want to get in that discussion now, but let's just so bride service involves prestations or gifts to legitimate conjugal unions, which are just from the groom, but not from his group. So the groom has to do it himself. He's doing it for himself. And what that means is that any relationship he has with his bride, the bride is in no way the property or labor, the part of the property of the groom's group. She is someone who has nothing to do with the groom's group. She stays within her own group. And typically what you find is then matrilineal postnuptial residence. In other words, that brides typically stay where they are, and grooms have to come over to brides and live with them. And not only that, but they have to try and keep negotiating their marital status or their conjugal status with their brides by performing bride service. In other words, by working for their in-laws, or affines, as anthropologists call them. So brides are working young men, grooms are working for their in-laws, and they spend the whole time trying to legitimate their conjugal union, which is always negotiable. It's not cast in stone by a transfer of cattle, or as it is in bridewell society. It's constantly having to be renegotiated by labour and respect, and using appropriate forms of language and all that thing. The groom in a bride service society is constantly having to demonstrate respect and working for his in-laws, particularly his mother-in-law, who has a particularly strong influence. So the respect relationship between mothers-in-law and sons-in-law is extremely important one in many of these societies, like the Kung and the Mosquito, that the mother-in-law, son-in-law relationship is the most important relationship in those kind of communities. It's the most important relationship of all. So what you have then is, instead of this vertical debt to senior members of your own lineage, as you get in with the bridewell, in bride service, that grooms are constantly in debt to their in-laws for recognizing them as conjugal partners of their daughters. So you have this kind of thing of trying to ingratiate themselves, young men trying to ingratiate themselves and into the good graces of their in-laws. That's what kinship is about. So it's completely different to bridewell. It's very, very, very different. And it's typically found where there isn't very little land. There's not really very much in the way of significant movable property, and where there's often a shortage of labour. So you very much kind of find it in sort of like forest areas. Bride service is the style of conjugal union that's found all over the Amazon. It's found in foraging societies in Southern Africa and historically in Australia, Aboriginal peoples, and so on. So you've got this very, very different kind of style. And what I've termed these kind of style of if you like, kinship, or the way of imagining relations, as I called it, the politics of intimacy, because political processes in the community, in these kind of communities, often turn on these affinal relationships in bride service societies, where men have to find that to ingratiate themselves with their affines. And what you find is that it's not so much even ingratiating yourself with your father-in-law, because your father-in-law is an outsider too. He's come to this same group. You've got these groups of women who live close by, mothers, daughters, maternal aunts, maternal grandmothers, maternal grandaunts, who may be in one place or would imagine themselves as one particular group with this, which I call the Confederacy of Sisters in somewhere else, although there may be sometimes mothers and aunts and so on. And you have then you have these men, and it will include your father-in-law, who's similarly an outsider, or he might have gone a little way further down the line to becoming part of that group, who've detached themselves from their own group and have almost in some instances been thrown out of their own group to try and sort of make it with the a confederacy of sisters in another group. So this is classically what you find in bride service societies organized around what I've called here the politics of intimacy. And one article which I think importantly described it, although I've argued in some work that it only describes part of it. It's like bride service is a bit like this big elephant, and they've looked at one side of it, but I don't think it's a complete account of bride service. But nevertheless, it has a lot of merit that their particular model is that what you find in this kind of situation is where grooms have to negotiate their status with affines is that they achieve adult status through marriage. It's through having a conjugal union. And those conjugal unions are made slowly by grooms insinuating themselves into their bride's group's good graces, as I've said. So men's adult status is always under threat from peers who view one another uneasily as competitors, because in these kind of groups that conjugal unions are always quite provisional there. So marriage is not something there's in these kind of groups, it's not suddenly that you have this big ritual one day and the next day you're married and everything changes. It's a gradual process of negotiation. You find, therefore, that brother-in-law relationships between wife-giving and wife-taking brother-in-law, if we can use those terms, highly, although it's more the other way around, it's more really women who are giving men, but brother-in-law relationships are highly charged, and in some cases they're moderated by classificatory sister exchange, which diffuses the imbalance. So a part of the aesthetic of the politics of intimacy, a very nice aesthetic, what people really like, is sister exchange, and there's some examples in the village where I've worked. Sorry, yeah.
I'm sorry. So the brother-in-law relationship is between two men who both married into the same.
No. One is the brother of the bride, or the classificatory brother of the bride, and the other is the marrying in.
Oh yes, good. Okay.
Yeah. So it's an asymmetrical relationship.
Can I just echo something you said earlier, Mark, which is the word marriage is not that useful. An important point really with bride service, as you said, the man never actually gets married. He never acquires, like, okay, I've got conjugal rights. This is my wife. He's always, earning his relationship.
That's exactly right. And that's my next bullet point, which says that young women have little use for husbands and consequently use sexual intercourse as a political weapon. That this is very classically the case in these kind of groups, and certainly the case amongst the Miskitu. And sexual intercourse, which is very much about procreation in brides wealth societies, where you're creating more children for the lineage, and all this kind of thing, that it's not, because it's more imagined, and discourses surrounding sexual intercourse are more about recreation and enjoyment rather than procreation.
Just perhaps to add to that is that women have every interest in kind of denying that actually sex is what creates a baby.
Creates baby.
You often get what's called ignorance of maternity. It's not ignorance at all. It's just women have an interest in saying this baby comes to us and our brothers, not from the man.
And
in case he can use that as an excuse to hang on in there. And
I've got a theory about that, which I've never. It's in those kind of things, because exactly the point you're making, that men have, on the other hand, have a vested interest in trying really hard to claim those babies, because that legitimates their status as a conjugal partner.
Exactly.
And it's in those kind of people, amongst those kind of people, that we typically find things like the cuvade or phantom pregnancies,
Yeah.
because that's the way men, part of the way that which they claim their offspring of their conjugal partners, and therefore they become more men and more attached to the group and so forth. In Mosquito, they call it basni, but of course it's found with same thing really. That's basni is exactly that. Right. That's just a little bit of background to contextualize my discussion of this particular case study. I'm going to talk about now the Miskitu, with whom I've been working for the last 32 years. The Miskitu, there are approximately now 150,000 Miskitu speakers. Most of them live on northeast Nicaragua and also bits eastern Honduras. Where I worked was a southernmost a Mosquito enclave in a predominantly Creole-speaking area, Creole English-speaking area. There's Caribbean English is spoken all along the coast of Central America, the Caribbean in different communities. And there are a number in this area where this hook, which is right on the middle of the Caribbean coast, just below where it says sea, you can see there's this little hook, and this is so-called Pearl Lagoon. And you find here Creole and Mosquito communities, or communities that identify as such.
There was a puppet English-speaking kingdom, I think.
Yeah, I mean, just to what extent it was puppet is a contested thing, but yeah, you're right. Yeah. So this particular area is one where you have the southernmost Mosquito communities, but also you've got in this area, not so much further up, you've got a lot of communities, or some communities, which are so-called Creole, which are Caribbean English-speaking, monolingual Caribbean English-speaking. I did field work. I've been doing field work in a place called Kakabila, which is here, and like all the, it's identifies, most people identify as Mosquito, but it's people there speak Creole English, Nicaraguan Creole English, or Mosquito Coast Creole English, as well as Mosquito. Mosquito being an Amerindian language, which is related to a few other Central American languages, but not very closely related to other languages at all. So the inhabitants in Kakabila are bilingual in Mosquito and Mosquito Coast Creole, an Amerindian language, and a Creole language. So the Mosquito Coast, what is it actually like? Well, it's not really like Mesoamerica at all. It's not like the sort of communities up into Guatemala and Mayan communities and other communities in Mexico, indigenous communities. It's Mosquito Coast is much more like Amazonia. It's like a bit of Amazonia that's kind of stuck on the shoulder of Central America. So it has rainforests. It has people use canoes rather than walking about. It's swidden horticulture. There's classificatory cross-cousin marriage, which one finds in Amazonia, across Amazonia, but not really in Mesoamerica. So it's just really very much like Amazonia. And the flora and fauna are very much like what's in Amazonia. So this is something, a photo I took about when I was only there for about 3 weeks. So that's, shows you it's not sort of like Mexico, most of Mexico. So what do people do then to earn their living? That historically it's been or when I was first there, and I was first doing field work there in the early 90s, it was horticulture for subsistence. So people grew cassava, plantain, dasheen, rice. These are all cultigens that are grown more like in Amazonia than in Mesoamerica. There's hunting for deer, peccary, and much smaller animals to some extent, although horticulture was much more important. In the coast, in some of the interior mosquito communities, inland of the coast a little bit, hunting's more important, but fishing is really important on the coast. So there's fish, certain kinds of fish, shrimp, turtle out on the Keys, which are little desert islands just off the Caribbean coast, lobster and crab. The thing for marine resources, when I was first there, that's how people generated a little cash, because you could sell some of those things for cash, whereas you couldn't for horticultural, for sort of those cultigens, you couldn't really sell those. They had to be just given. Those things were sold to some degree for cash, but people primarily within the community, even marine resources, were given freely through a system that was known as pana pana, which really translates The only thing that comes close to it is really reciprocity. It's a pana is what the Mosquito term for reciprocity. Now, though, there are new catch opportunities for people from this village that people now are much more, if you like, plugged into the global economy. There are opportunities for much more cash than before. When they were just fishing and selling their catches for cash, it was really for very, very little money. Now there's a lot more money available for lobster, which is a new kind of economy because there's the new markets. There's shipping out, which is young men who speak Caribbean English, which the southern Miskitu do, as well as the Creoles, that they go and work on cruise ships as menials, and they send money home as remittances through Western Union, MoneyGram, and so forth. There's cocaine money, that the cocaine trade is now, the Mosquito Coast has become one of the routes up from South America to North America. The cocaine comes from San Andres, which is an island in the Caribbean, and it's moved forward along the Caribbean coast from Pearl Lagoon up through in Nicaragua, through Honduras, up to and eventually through Mexico and so on. And the other opportunity for new catch opportunities is what they call crossing the Rio Bravo. Has anybody heard of the Rio Bravo? You'll have heard of it, yeah, the film, but you'll have heard of it by its English name. It's the Rio Grande. Yeah, they call it, but in Latin America and South and Central America, they call it the Rio Bravo.
Yeah.
Crossing the Rio Bravo means going illegally into the United, or semi-legally into the United States. So crossing the Rio Bravo is just a word, even though many of them don't actually cross the river, they go more to the west in some instances where you don't cross the river, but it's still crossing the Rio Bravo. You're going to the United States, where you go as an illegal or semi-legal asylum seeker or whatever, and basically you live in chip conditions, doing chip jobs if you can find them, and trying to get a little bit of money to send home. Sorry, yeah.
So is that men and women?
Men, it's predominantly men.
Because the women tend to stay.
They tend more to stay, but some women do go. I know certainly some women who go.
And is the cocaine, this processed cocaine rather than cocoa, which is then?
Yes, sorry, that's quite right. Yeah, the cocaine is not in any way cultivated there at all. It comes already processed as powder, which is generally done, I think, on the Caribbean coast of Colombia, that kind of area, places like Santa Marta, Barranquilla, Cartagena, and then it comes as powder up through the coast. I'm going to talk a bit more about that later, but that's yeah, that's a useful clarification. So the Miskitu, as I said, in Kakabila, are just like many other bride service peoples, are organised around what I've called, this is not their term, a confederacy of sisters. And what you find is this is very typically what you get when you take a photo, go to a Mosquito community and just to say, oh, I'd like to take a photo of some of you. What happens is they get all the people together who are part of their confederacy. So this is taken in Saclin near the Honduras frontier. This is taken in Cara, but these are classically the kind of photos you get, lots of groups of women. The women are typically closest to their mothers, sisters, daughters, maternal aunts, because these are people, just like as I've said for the bride service model, who tend to group together. So they typically live in houses that are clustered close by, that their spouses, which the word is Maya, means spouse in Mosquito, have built for them. So part of the bride service is that men will build houses for their spouses, for their women folk, and so on. So these relationships are of these confederacies of sisters are built on mutual help and assistance, and quite often enmity between enemy groups, rival groups. So you have these confederations who sometimes are in alliances with other similar confederations, but are quite often at odds with them. And you have these processes where sometimes the one confederation may segment, and then for other contexts come back together again, much as how, as some of you anthropologists here will know, was the model described for patrilineal descent by Evans Pritchard. It's actually quite similar. It's surprisingly usefully predictive for Kakabila, except it's for, if you like, matrilineal groups. So here's another one. This is Karawala. These are Ulwa people who are not Mosquito, but they speak Miskitu as their first language, but they're Ulwa. And this is a very tough group, this particular group, who I got to know well. This is Francella, who's important, who's a very feared sorceress, as well as fist fighter and everything like that. She's, yeah. So you have this idea of fission and fusion. So the groups over time, these confederations of sisters, as they get bigger and bigger, they tend to segment as cousins and second cousins, as they get more and more distance, tend to end up in disputes with each other. So there's the big group. In some contexts, the groups will come together, but in others, it'll be much smaller groups. Let's try to imagine these triangles as actually circles, anthropologists amount to, because anthropologists typically have triangles as males, but if you imagine this as circles, it's quite good. What happens is that the crisis that one has in many of these groups is the death of the kuka. The kuka is the senior woman in any one of these groups, is known as the kuka. That's Mosquito for grandmother, but it also means senior, elder, respected woman. And when you have the death or loss of influence of a kuka, it's the moments where you have segmentation as often as when particular sub-segments, if you like, or leaders of those sub-segments, sub-leaders contest the authority of their group.
So why don't we have circles? Why aren't there triangles on your data?
Well, because I didn't make it and I'm not technologically capable, so I finished this one, which is taken from the
Copied
Yeah.
Yes, please.
circle
Yeah, please
instead of the
circle.
triangle.
Incredibly confusing, Mark.
Yeah, but it's easy.
So you
just
get
think
fusion,
of it, yeah.
but sometimes you
Fission,
get fusion where different segments will come together. And a classic example of this is that women play baseball against other villages. And what will happen, these segments, who maybe you find in Kakabila, you find maybe anything between 5 and 10 segments at any particular time in the recent history, will come together as a united group against other villages, sort of thing. And then when the tournament ends, the different segments will separate and be at odds with one another again. But the founding of Kakabila is really a myth, which is that the myth of Kakabila is that it was founded by two men called Sylvester Vega and Sylvester Joseph and Cristobal Vega. And Sylvester Joseph married one of Cristobal Vega's daughters. And so you have this myth of this man marrying into this group of sisters. And these are sisters, Angelina, Claudina, Frida, Helena, Matilda. These are supposedly the founding confederacy of sisters through which all the others are, if you like, split off over in time as segments. So it's probably the history of Kakabila is obviously a lot more complicated than that, but it's interesting that for Kakabila people that they have essentialized their history in terms of this myth of a man marrying into this confederacy of sisters. And that's how it came about. And these were represented as being the grandmothers of the existing old women of Kakabila, although it's probably their grandmothers, in fact, represented them as their grandmothers too. So this is a kind of myth that perhaps has less exact truth than it has a lot of sociological truth, if you see what I mean, which is very often the case, as anthropologists from time have argued. So, yeah. Now, what about men, though, in this kind of, how do they work in this social thing? So the male social universe in Kakabila is, as I said, is men attach themselves as affines, which is anthropology talk for in-laws, and establish relationships with their brothers-in-law, which are called Maikat, and with their fathers-in-law, which are mutually, they call each other Datna, with their wife's mother's brother, Swigat, and so forth. So they try to attach themselves with other males from their wife's group, some of whom have married into the group, some of whom are perhaps brothers of the members of the Confederacy of Sisters. So they work with one another. And so here you have son-in-law working with his father-in-law, This is Dama Mercado, and this is Castro or Locos, his nicknames, and they work one another. That's very typical kind of thing. And these kind of affinal or in-law relationships between males are typically reproduced through rum-drinking rituals and so on. And they project these ritual forms of avoidance and respect, especially with their female in-laws. So men have to show great respect to their fathers-in-law, but even more to their mothers-in-law, but also to other senior affines. That's something that's incredibly important. So young men would approach their mother-in-law. They wouldn't approach them face to face, even if they were living in the same house or close by. They typically, if they had to address them, they'd turn away from them and address them in a high, squeaky voice, sort of thing, which is a sort of interesting sort of socio-lectural sort of thing that they do that shows respect. So this is what they do. And this applies not just into life, but also into death. So here is Kuka Santa, who's an old lady who's died in the village of Parawala, and her relatives have all insisted that her bride service observing sons-in-law all come and be photographed showing respect to their mother-in-law, even after her death, that she's still exercising this enormous influence over her sons-in-law. So this is the funeral for Kuka Santa. These are her 4 sons-in-law gathered together to demonstrate respect for her in a kind of post-mortem bride service. So how is this actually, the politics of intimacy, how is it actually policed? It's policed through things like respect, as I've said, as you've just seen an example, but also respect and as well, but also through something which is like shame. So it's avoidance they use the word swera, which translates as shame. And also, in other ways, it's policed. So men are, if you like, resources. It's like about, in some ways, it's like about groom capture. So men are resources to be captured by the Confederacy of Sisters and then domesticated, sometimes through magic. So the Creole term, panty water, which is just like what it sounds, is a kind of magic where women use their secretions that are in their panties as a form of magic to really disempower their husband. So the ritualization.
That's what kind of secretion?
Well, this is a family show, Chris.
Imagination, shall we?
Yeah. But anyway, the ritualization of the capture of males, so this is a bride capture, a groom capture, is ritualized by women in a game called Kitty Alley, which is played once a year, where all the men of the village play all the women, and the men typically are encouraged to wear something blue, and they have these blue, you can't see this black and white photo, but the blue is on the right hand because the men are sitting this side. The women all sit on the other side and wear red for the day, and they have red ribbons here. So this is called Kitty Alley, and so this is a ritualization, this capture of males. And what happens during the course of Kitty Alley, very typically, is the older women will be sit on some benches over there, sort of basically just making fun of or taking piss out of the young men, and so telling them that if they don't throw away their shots or lose their shots, they're not going to let them dance with their daughters that night at the dance, which always follows Kitty Alley. So this is a ritualization of groom capture. So magic and ritual reproduce the politics of intimacy through things like Kitty Alley, fancy water, and a number of other things. But I just want to give those two as kind of examples. So this was Kakabila 32 years ago when I first started doing fieldwork there. That you have here properly, the women are circles again, and the men are properly triangles. Because I could do this myself. This one. This is just about the extent of my technological expertise. Each different colour of circles is a confederacy of sisters, a group of women who are together, and they're co-identified by the same colour. And you have the men who move. So the men from the, if you like, the red group on the bottom of women leaves this confederacy of sisters to attach himself as an in-law to the blue confederacy of sisters, and so on. So we see the men leaving their own confederacy of sisters to try and ingratiate themselves with their in-laws, who are these blue circles in that kind of case. That's what this red triangle of male is trying to do.
It's a beautiful diagram.
And Yeah, I did it myself. So yeah, and so this is what we found 32 years ago. Yeah, so this is what happens. And in the Creole communities, which are close by, you've actually also got confederacies of sisters. But what happens is that, and this is very well described by Nancy Gonzalez in her books on the Garifuna or Black Caribs, who of Honduras, but also other people who've worked in Caribbean English-speaking communities, is you tend to have women who kind of stick together, and the males may go off and make children, but inevitably they'll come back, or they'll come back a lot to their group. So it's quite different to the Miskitu thing, which is where the men move. In the Creole communities close to Kakabila, or the communities that identify Creole, you tend to get this kind of thing. I should add that you do get both kinds in both communities, but part of being Mosquito or Creole is not about who your parents is, but it's about projecting what kind of morality you subscribe to determines whether you identify as Creole or Mosquito. And this is all part of the kind of morality that you project will determine whether you say, I'm Creole or I'm Mosquito.
So in that version, the men are really diolo, aren't they? They move to and fro.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really important because in any matrilineal society, a man always has to keep in touch with his sisters. So there's always an element of duolocality.
But here it's very, very strong
That's
in
right.
this. And it's very well described in a number of books on the so-called Black Caribs or Honduras and Belize. By people like Virginia Kearns, by Nancy Gonzalez, and things who've described this. But it's very interesting because some of the villages in the Pearl Lagoon Basin are descendants of Black Caribs who came down to work in the logging camps in about 100 years ago, 120 years ago.
So are the visiting, is it visiting day at a time, several days of a month? What's the time?
For the Creole things,
Yes.
it's more like that he might go and live, say a man might go and live in this kind of community for a bit in what looks like the Mosquito model for a bit, but then decides he's had enough, sort of thing. And so you have serial monogamy from for both men and women, if you like. Yeah. So conjugal unions in Kakabila for those who identify as Mosquito and practice this kind of model. It's that conjugal unions tend to be lifelong or quite lengthy, whereas on those they're kind of short-lived, basically. So that's fundamentally the difference.
So that's a moral difference.
It's a moral difference, and as I wrote in my article on Mosquito or Creole, I wrote an article about this, that identifying as Mosquito or Creole in Kakabila and some of the neighbouring communities is not so much about to do with some kind of primordial identity, something to do with your descent, your or anything like that. It's about to which particular morality you've subscribed to. And Kakabila is primarily a community which where Miskitu and use of the Mosquito languages is, if you like, the preferred identity and moral stance, if you like, to Creole, whereas in other communities, it's it's not necessarily the case. I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that, but that is quite like that. So now I want to look, let's see how we're doing, some changes to the economy. And this, there are a number of changes that have taken place in the area. One is the so-called advance of the frontera agricola. And now that Nicaragua has had a frontier, just as Brazil has in the United States in the 19th century and other places, but the frontier has moved from west to east. The Spanish speakers settled the Pacific sides of Nicaragua and Honduras and didn't really come very much over to the other side because it was there weren't really much in the way of exploitable products there, or at least that they could extract at that time. Now it's a bit different and so forth. But since the 1950s, the agricultural frontier has gradually moved, Spanish-speaking frontier, into Mosquito, the area of the Mosquito and other indigenous peoples. So what you find also is the Mosquito have become much more involved in the extraction of marine resources. In the past, they were primarily, like 80 years ago, they were primarily involved in Sweden horticulture and hunting, but now they're much more involved in fishing, and to this they've added lobster. the Mosquito coast has become progressively monetized as people have to, as the state kind of sets up things like schools, and people have to buy school uniforms, and lots of other things, that foodstuffs like rice and beans have come in, and some people become more dependent on those. So you have the progressive monetization of the coast. You have the employment of young men as menials on cruise ships, those in English speaking. Further up in the northern Mosquito communities, you don't get that because the people don't really speak English very much. But in the southern Mosquito, where I've been working, they speak English as well as Mosquito, and so they can get jobs as menials on cruise ships. And also, but in the north, the lobster economy has become very important, and dollars have come into the economy that way. And what you've also had is another change to the economy, is you've had this massive, in common with all the rest of Nicaragua, is you've had hundreds of thousands of Nicaraguans traveling north into the United States, seeking el sueño americano, the American dream, and so on. And something like possibly as much as nearly 10% of Nicaraguans have left their country and gone seeking work across the Rio Bravo in the United States, you know, as much as that, since, including 2018. That's an extraordinary figure. Yeah. Also,
sorry, that's since 2018?
Yeah, 18.
So that just recently?
Recently, yeah, in the last 6 years.
Wow.
Enormous number. I know so many people who have gone, villages have been emptied out all over Nicaragua. This is not just the Mosquito coast. And then you've had, on the Mosquito coast, what you've had is they've sent, some of them in some cases have sent remittances back, money back, and so money from cruise ship employees and from those who have in the United States. These dollar remittances constitute a big change. So you've got a lot of money coming in. You've also got the greater involvement of many Mosquito in the cocaine economy, because since around about the turn of the century, a lot more cocaine has been coming up into this area, as we already decided. One reason it's come up this way, rather than historically it's gone up before then, the more ease up the Trans-American Highway and across up Central America, or the West Indies Antilles chain or something like that. The Mosquito coast is much less well policed. It's much more remote. This is very remote. There are virtually no roads in this whole area. This is really remote. There's one road that sort of goes like that, and now in the last few years, another one that's just gone from down here, but this is really remote. Nearly all transport within this area is waterborne or on foot along the rivers, up the coast on canoes, and or little sailing vehicle vessels, or on foot, or perhaps some occasionally on horse, not occasionally, but sometimes on horseback. So it's also, the cocaine economy is much less well policed. On the other hand, it's still like the Wild West insofar as it's much less control, and the traffickers are much more dependent because of the remoteness on local people. And so it's a lot more fractious and dangerous for the traffickers than otherwise, although it's much less well policed. Right. So what you've got now, though, is how are we doing for time? Is now that what you've happened is that you have this monetarization of the economy. The economy of Kakabila and this area in general is where it was dependent. People's subsistence was dependent on a pana on reciprocal help in terms of looking after your farms, your swidden horticultural plots. In other words, working together. Building houses was something that people did together, often brothers-in-law and fathers-in-law and sons-in-law, and then women from the kin group whose house it was being built for, because houses belong to women, would provide sustenance for the men helping the house. This was all part of the pana complex, which was part of, if you like, matrilineal Kakabila. All of that is like eroding now because you've got money now. People, instead of having to reciprocate, they'd rather pay someone, those who have money. And there are the iniquities or inequalities because there are some families who've done quite well out of things. They've had cocaine fines, because fines are typically opportunist, and they've done quite well and been able to use their money to employ others. Others have done much less well in this monetarized economy. And so you have a growing if you like, inequalities between different groups and so on. What you find that those groups, kin groups who have got access to money, have been able to invest it and make more money. They've been able to buy outboard motors instead of relying on sheet sail skiffs to be able to catch fish, to go and look for turtle and things like that. They've been able to kind of extract lumber through buying chainsaws and things like that. So they've been able to build strong, better houses, or better, what they think is better houses out of cement rather than the leaf houses, or later the board houses that Mosquito used beforehand, and so on. So you have this great monetization of the economy. Now, what's happening with that, the money, is that men now, who, because they're in the, if you like, the industries where cash comes in, that they're using the cash for themselves, and they're building, their houses are permanent, so they can't say, well, wait a minute, I don't want to build next to my in-laws for the rest of my life. Before, when I built a legal board house, I could move quite quickly. I want something permanent. They're building them next to their own kin group, their own natal kin group. So you get men now are collecting, and you're getting groups of men, groups of brothers who are becoming, if you like, confederacies in a sense. This is not, still the old model still is there, but it's now been joined by this other kind of competing model of if you like, kinship, if we can call it that, which is organized around groups of brothers. And quite often this involves things like buying weapons, especially for those, because the cocaine economy is very pervasive. And if you're involved in that, and that's a very good and quick way, so it's thought to get money, that you need to be armed. So as well as the AK-47s that still around from the time of the Contra War in the 80s, these have been joined by other new kinds of assault weapons that are out there, as well as pistols, and hunting rifles have been used for other effect. And you have now much more violence, and this violence typically takes place between groups of brothers. Groups of brothers often, as I said, because of this changing style of cement houses with money from all these sources, build their houses closer together. And if you like, women's position is like being more marginalized in this new kind of politics of intimidation, as opposed to the politics of intimacy. This, hence the title. I changed the title a little bit, but that's just came to me this yesterday. And so you've got this new kind of politics, which is where men this is going on. So you have groups of brothers who start businesses and then protect those businesses against rival businesses through intimidation, like they start little bars, which they call ranches in the local Caribbean English. They call you have men who work together as in working for bigger traffickers and things like that. So you have typically brothers and fathers and sons, it's only yesterday that two brothers who were involved in the killing of two other brothers in a cocaine transaction that went wrong were surrounded by the police, and one of them was killed in Taspa County by the police, and another escaped wounded. And so this happens all the time. You have vengeance killings, revenge killings by people when groups of brothers become in conflict with one another. And you really, this is a very, very different kind of, society has a, if you can reify that term again for a moment, has a very different complexion now than it had in this area 32 years ago, where essentially everyone more or less had the same kind of technology, insofar as they'd have their machete, a hoe, they had their board house, and they had a canoe, and that was it, and their fishing nets and so on. Everyone had that. So you had, if you like, communities were organized by a very kind of fairly safe equality that was perhaps never, and the only ripples were perhaps bride service sort of arguments or things like that, ripples, which were, but now what you're having is something which is much sort of more dangerous and much more horrible. I think.
Basically gang warfare.
It's essentially, yeah, it's gang warfare, and it's organised around kinship. And one example of that is that one of the leaders, one gangster in Kakabila, who now has just been captured. The police have just done a major crackdown. Thank God, they got rid of the corrupt police that were there. Now they put in, I don't know how long it will last, but they put in a police who are very much more on it. They captured one fellow, a Creole fellow who wasn't even from Kakabila, he was living in Kakabila with a Kakabila woman, that he got his son to murder the son of another gang leader in another community. And that's how it works. It's father and son and brothers who are members of your kin group. So what you've got now is this move away from bride service to we don't know what yet. We don't know how what is happening yet, because the role of women. So, for example, Dean, this person who they just captured, who sort of terrorized Kakabila a little bit, or quite a lot for a while, who's now been captured, that his wife was really colluded in, or they saw his conjugal partner, if we can call Delcy that it was basically, you know, that she would operate in sort of in a kind of reflected glory or fear of her husband, but say if anyone disagreed with her, she would say, "You don't know who you're dealing with," sort of thing, you know. And this was an allusion to her gangster spouse, sort of thing. So this is what's changing, and it's sort of interesting to kind of think about. And I've been trying to work it out, but these are comparatively new developments, and they still coexist with the old bride service style of model, which many people are still quite poor in these communities and still working with the old kind of pana as far as they can. But you've got this new kind of style of politics of intimidation, which, if you like, is infiltrating and poisoning the politics of intimacy. So I'll stop there. Thank you. There's a picture of the old style houses. You see with the leaf roof and the board, and this is a new cement house here, which is built by partly drugs money, partly shipping out money. These is a cruise ship, the kind that they work on, many of them young men. And this is the Coast Guard, who are just picking up these bales of cocaine, which are floating out there on the Caribbean Sea and have been waiting to be rescued. What happens is that when the pangas, which are the speedboats, which when they're trailed by the Coast Guard or whoever, or the police or the Naval or whoever, they'll throw the cargo over to make them go faster and at the same time get rid of the evidence. And then sometimes the police will pick them up, sometimes they'll float along onto the shore or one of the quays and be picked up by a fisherman who's been poor all his life, who suddenly finds himself with like $5,000 worth of whatever. In fact, one of the most famous gang leader of this kind of cocaine baron in the region, Ted Heyman, that he actually started off just like that as a poor fisherman who had a find of maybe half a dozen of these kind of sacks and built up his empire from that. Okay, I'll stop there.
Fantastic. So I'm going to thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop. We can probably shut down the slides so we get rid of the light.
Okay.
Shall we do
Yeah,
that?
yeah, of course.
Shall we just come around and, that's a scary.
You could minimize it just in case someone wants that budget.
Well, it was just if we well, if you want to.
Oh yeah, no, go for it.
Shut down the
no, absolutely.
Are you hearing all right on Zoom? Because I had the machine turned away. Did you hear all right?
Yes, thank you.
You did hear.
Shall I
Great.
shut it down?
Okay, yeah, because then we get rid of that bright light and
That's
and
fine.
the screen's fine. I think we can talk.
Yeah, we heard fine, Camilla. Also, we heard you a lot too. So
Oh, good. Okay, I was probably because I was close to the machine. I should have been more muted. Sorry about that. Do we want questions in the room? Anybody? Lex?
That was just so like sad and heartbreaking.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to tell everyone that as well. I was just wondering what your interaction with the Mosquito was like.
Okay.
You're a member of
Yes.
society, aren't you? You're
Um,
a relative.
Yeah, I mean,
Fine.
I'm an affine in that I've been married to a Miskitu woman who I met. Well, it's when I first met her, she was at the University of Managua, so she's not entirely, although she's from a village background, that she's actually. But yeah, she is Miskitu, and I lived there twice, first for a year and a half, and then for a year, and I've been there apart from that about another 13 times between 1 month and 3 months. So I probably spent altogether about maybe 5 years on the coast, on the Mosquito coast. I speak Mosquito fluently, also they charitably tell me, you know, I speak it better than Spanish, which is kind of surprising. It's a bit like someone who comes to the UK and ends up speaking better Welsh than English. So, yeah, so yeah, and so I'm my wife is in contact with the members of her family on a day-to-day basis, and we'll talk over WhatsApp, which is now, thankfully, WhatsApp has really saved my finances in that it's free now to talk, and people have internet and now, or they can buy what they call
And
cards.
your wife lives just up here in London. Your
In
wife
London,
lives
yeah.
up the road.
Well, for the last 21 years, yeah. So yeah, so I'm sort of yeah, I mean, I would say I'm sort of pretty without
Right.
Great question.
well, that's a very good question. I mean, you know, it's of course, men who do bride service always say, and I'm not going to buck the trend, they always say, I never didn't have to do that. But of course, it's probably not true. Yeah. Yeah.
Any more in the
What happens in the bride service to the older men, you know, as men get older, sort of like seeing you know, with the bride well, sort of like women get a bit discarded, don't they, as they get older?
Yeah, in bride service, it's kind of very interesting because it's slightly the converse of that. It's not exactly, but that men become more surplus to requirements of
as they get
yeah,
older.
and what you find is, and this is something that you see a lot, is older men who really try hard to keep going to their farm, even though they shouldn't really be going and should be kind of having a rest, and they probably would be in many other places, but they sort of desperately don't want to show that they're no longer productive. And sometimes it's kind of quite heartbreaking when you see some like really old fellas, you know, really kind of struggling, and yeah.
Are they taken care of by
They are taken care of, but they or usually they are. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say always, you know, it's varies like anywhere else, you know, but yeah, but somehow that their position, they lose, sort of perhaps less respected, and that younger people make more fun of them and things like that. So
Any other questions in the room? What about Zoom? Did you have anybody wanting to ask anything?
I sort of had a question.
Wait, Manchego, and then I'll come back. Manchego.
Do you ever see groups of brothers that marry groups of sisters? Something like that happen?
Marrying groups of sisters.
yeah, that's a very interesting case. Yes, that does happen. It's not something which is kind of organized specifically, but what you'll find is that people will say, oh, I see a lot of people in your family have married a lot of people in their family, and they'll say, yes, well, they're good people. That's the way they rationalize it. So it's, yeah, you do see that, but it's not something which is kind of ever discussed as a kind of a strategy so much. But yeah, what you find often is in this interesting the new kind of style of kinship is that where you have, if you like, brides now coming to live with groups of brothers more, which is, you know, the new style of kinship, if you like, you can call it kinship. The new, what you find is that you find that a lot of hostility between sisters-in-law. Sister-in-law hostility was always something that was there. It's part of the politics of intimacy, in that, you know, there's a kind of a perception of a tug of war between the sister and the spouse over the man, you know, for their labor and everything like that, and whatever they can provide. So you find that that is something which is a kind of very common. But the thing with sisters-in-law in the old kind of thing was that they were at a distance to one another. So I don't go to that part of the village because, you know, so-and-so lives there and that's my sisters-in-law, basically is what they mean. But now what you find is with this mix of the two new things, that you find sisters-in-law who are actually living together and loathe each other because of these same issues. And that's sister-in-law hostility is something which has really become endemic, or at least it existed before, but was sort of moderated by geography, if you like, and now it's not.
In the traditional system, when a man would do some work for his sister and some work for his bride, would they be different types of work? Would it be, or would there be a real conflict because exactly the same kind of work would be demanded of both categories?
It would depend very much on the particular example, but I know of cases where it is the same kind of thing, which is. And this is often comes to the sort of, but that's an interesting question in the sense that can you go to your brother or to your, and or will your brother come to you rather and ask for cooked food or things like fish or things that are not cooked food and things like that? So the cooks,
in my sort of theoretical model, I suppose I wouldn't have expected a man's hunting produce to go to his sister. If it's too sexual hunting for meat, bringing that back would imply some kind of wrong kind of relationship.
Turtles and things come.
no, turtle would likely go, some turtle go to the mother, but probably the mother-in-law would be the most likely to be the principal recipient of it. Yeah, and quite often that sort of mothers and sisters often kind of express a bit of feeling hard done by, that they're not getting what they're
what the bride's getting, what
yeah.
sister-in-law's getting.
If the brother's bringing meat back to mum and sister, is that a slight on their spouses?
Yeah, I mean, if they don't give any to the spouses, then it would. I would think in most cases.
Well, no. What I mean is, I meant that if the man is married to a woman and then he comes and brings meat to his sister and his mother, is that a slight on his sister's husband and his mother's?
I wouldn't say so. No, I can't think of that. But what it would be a sign of distancing self from his spouse.
Yes.
So that is probably where that might be flagged up. But that's a very interesting point and something I'll look out for next time I see it.
And also the other question I had before was, to what extent are you looking at love matches and pair bonds, and what extent is it just facultative according to what the man is perceived as being capable of delivering in terms of the label and results?
Yeah, I mean, people become conjugal spouses for all kinds of reasons there, just as they do over here. But what's interesting is perhaps that is the discourses of why people do that. Like the discourse over here, not say it's always here, but the discourse is that people marry for love. Whereas in Kakabila, amongst older people, is that people marry because, you know, perhaps they're a good family, meaning they show respect, and that generally when you try to pick that down, and that they have the means of support, perhaps for their daughter, that the groom has the means of support for the daughter, and so on. So in that sense, it's perhaps framed in a sort of economic way. It's not that but now you do get more kind of amongst young people. There are discourses of love. These are, but one wonders to what extent that these discourses of love are, not to say love didn't exist, but discourses that mention love are in fact introductions from telenovela world, you know. Now, since Kakabila, when I was first there, it didn't have electricity, didn't have running water, no roads. There's still no road there, but there is electricity, and there's periodically running water and the electricity goes down some of them, but there's a lot of the time they watch the television, and telenovelas have, I think, perhaps had, which are basically Spanish language soap operas, which are made in, for those who don't know it, mostly in Mexico or Colombia. They have these telenovelas, and that these are, I think, perhaps had an influence on discourses of how people talk about their relations, even if perhaps there's not so much difference, but they certainly have an influence on discourses of, hi.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, go
Sorry,
ahead.
go.
I was going to ask Shakti, but go.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. The question that I just wanted to ask was about when the women are now moving into, well, yeah, when they're the ones that sort of migrating to live with their spouses, is that, do they justify that somehow in the older sort of morality, or is there another sort of, like, I don't know, ethic of individual rationalism involved?
Yeah, I think so. I think probably so. And I think with that becomes a more a reinvention of selfhood, if you like, in terms of ideas about, individual choice and things like that. It's a very interesting question, and one I'd have to kind of give some more thought to, but it really is an interesting question. Yeah.
Shakti, you want to ask?
Hi, yeah, that was a really interesting talk. I wanted to ask, so with this transition, in a way, in the economy of men and also in the kinship system, has there been a transition in women's economy as well in terms of what they're doing now? And
Right, that's another good question.
So Shakti asked if there's been, with this transition, has there also been a transition in women's economy specifically?
Yeah, and related to that also, what the childcare system look like in terms of female and male participation before and now. So, for instance, were there men participating more, for instance, in looking after children before these economic changes, and has that shifted so that women are now doing more childcare and things like that? So I guess I'm asking about both those things linked together as well.
Also about the shifts of patterns of childcare, where men were more involved previously, and are women now doing more of it?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I think women are doing more of it because I think men's the kind of, I should add that still that many groups within places like Kakabila are still rely on Swidden horticulture and fishing, and still, kinship is very much like the old kind of style of bride service and so on. But where it's changed, I would say that men are absent much more. They're absent on cruise ships or out in the United States. They're absent on sort of runs doing, taking cocaine to different places. So there's much male absence is more profound, and so the burden of looking after women, looking after children, has fallen more on women. But that said, also some women have also shipped out. They've worked on cruise ships. There are quite a few who do that, and there are some women who have across the Rio Bravo gone to the United States, and so on. And there are some women who've managed to get quite a lot in remittances or through cocaine money, like Delcy, who I was talking about, and are able to employ people to do that. So it's quite different. And many women who have gone to work overseas, that the children have fallen into the hands now of grandmothers, and usually maternal mother. So grandmothers who always, were important within the Confederacy of Sisters, have now within the this new kind of style of domestic organization or family or whatever we call it, that now grandmothers are becoming much more directly responsible in many cases for they are become the primary, if you like, carers and nurturers for grandchildren. So that's something which is very much a tendency. Yeah. Thank you. Good,
Thanks.
very good question.
No, but go, or do,
Well,
you do it
in
now.
your discussions with colleagues, it's within Amazonian studies, can you just say a little bit about any sort of conclusions you arrived at in respect to what I was saying at the beginning, which is like, how general is this sort of pattern? And I mean, in other words, would you and other colleagues think that yes, in most cases, when you do get a transition, it's in that direction from matrilineal matrilogy to bride price instead of bride service, and that, I mean, how did your work fit into a wider pattern, I suppose?
Okay, there are some colleagues who've looked at the same kind of things that I've done, and some of them have found very similar patterns emerging where they've worked, like Dean Bartholomew amongst Urarina, for example, has written about bride service. Urarina are a Sweden horticulturalist group in Peru, in the Peruvian Amazon, and there's also colleagues who've worked, done some very interesting work amongst some colleagues who've done some interesting work amongst the Kuna of Panama, who are kind of unusual group of people, but in some ways they're quite like the Miskitu in some ways, but in other ways not like them at all. But people who are anthropologists who worked on the Kuna have found some of the things that I'm describing, have described those as well. There are many people who work lowland South Americanists who are the tendency is for many lowland South American to focus on, if you like, we can use perhaps what is perhaps a slight, I don't know if it's a dated distinction or not, but focus on culture rather than society. And so whereas I'm interested here in looking at social processes, that many colleagues who are, I guess, Americanists, we could call them, worked in lowland South America, South and Central America, are interested in more kind of things like myth and ritual and language and ideas, which is all very interesting. But I think those things need to be, I think my criticism of some of them is that they need to anchor their work more in social processes, So that's my own feeling, yeah.
Because those, I mean, I guess those myths are very classic, sorry.
Those myths are, sorry.
Okay, so the prospect is with these transition processes that we've got some sort of models potentially for earlier historic processes of evolution from what we would construe as probably the very original sort of egalitarian hunter-gatherers using bride service, going into economies where there's much more movable wealth and things like pig farming, things like livestock, obviously, and then landowning with bride wealth. But the difficulty, obviously, is really, do we correlate those processes with these very modern situations that are creating real inequities of wealth? And what's so interesting is the flux going on. So you've got two types of processes or trajectories going in different directions in the same place, even.
Yeah. And I think you found there's some interesting work being done in Central Africa, which has looked at these kind of things by on the Suku, for example, where they've looked at this kind of thing in interesting ways. By the fellow who wrote that kinship textbook that I used to teach. What's his name again?
What, Holy? Not Holy.
Yeah, Ladislav Holy. Yeah, he's got that, and he in his book he discusses. It's a textbook on kinship, but he looks at exactly this. He has a section on this process because he's clearly quite interested in this, what's going on, and he cites some examples of something very similar that's going on in Africa. Yeah, I mean, and
there was also what's the name, Poe's book on the matrilineal group in the Luapula Valley, and then the Protestantism of the people who sort of broke away from the matrilineal clan and began working for their own household. That same sort of process, although it wasn't involved in this kind of the criminality or the luck and chance.
Well, that's quite interesting, because what you're saying, I haven't read that, but it sounds like it's, if you like, it's culture that's determined that, and
Yeah.
insofar as thinking new ideas about
Yeah.
morality and so forth. Whereas some people have approached it with a more perhaps technological determinism, and one thinks of perhaps some of the work that has examined why you have the so-called matrilineal belt in Africa,
Yeah.
you know, which is Zambia, Zimbabwe, parts of Congo, and Malawi. All that area is predominantly matrilineal descent, you know. And what's the reason for that? Is because there isn't much cattle, and because there isn't much cattle, because there's tsetse fly. So with that, the tsetse fly is, in a sense, preserved matrilineally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Said in harmony.
Yeah, I was only going to say that you as with everybody, the stories, the myths, and the ideas of how to do things will then be adapted to suit what you actually end
Oh
up
yeah,
doing.
what you do, yes,
Right.
exactly. The social, the
Yeah.
culture follows the social
The
process.
different emphases of different
Sure.
aspects of it, depending
sure.
on what you're.
Yeah.
then
And
finding.
that's why I included things like Kitty Alley for ritual and the myth of the foundation of Kakabila with the five sisters and everything,
Yes.
because I wanted to show that myth and ritual are embedded in kind of social processes and ideas about social processes.
Someone on Zoom wanted to know if you had played Kitty Alley.
Yes, I have. Yeah. I have played Kitty Alley. Yeah, it's.
And you didn't win.
Well, they always say, and this is a classic bride service argument, and I love it because it's so bride service. They always say, "Oh, the women always win because the men get drunk and miss their shot," and that you couldn't sort of make up about it, because you know men create solidarity in laws through ritual drinking, so they get drunk, but women win because they do in bride service societies. So this is the thing. So this is those two ideas are captured in this nice little idea that Kitty Alley is always won by women because men get too drunk and miss their shots. So I played it, yeah.
But it's quite clear that there will be circumstances. We've spoken about the sister-in-law animosity, but also about, was it Delcy, who is this fist-fighting and gun-toting lady?
She doesn't,
but
she doesn't fight, yeah.
No, she doesn't fight, she gets others to do it for her.
Yeah.
But so women will soon, some women will have interests in going with the patrilineal situation. There will be a kind of split apart of different way, a division of a kind of divide and rule.
So you've got a great difference between Delcy on the one hand, who's perhaps a product of this new kind of style, and then you've got Francella, who is the Ulva woman, who's the fist-fighting user of sorcery. She represents tough women in the old kind of style. Yeah, so Francella is old school sort of tough woman. Yeah.
What about women and firearms?
Generally, firearms seem to be women's kind of things. So, but women are kind of sometimes given firearms to hide, and it's suspected that Delcy still might have part of whatever the police didn't find of Dean's arsenal. You know, so.
I mean, do women actually use firearms?
No. What I have seen is though that women using knives. I remember I was staying in Karawala, which is a Ulwa village, but it's Mosquito speaking. It's just like same kind of thing. In fact, Francella is from there, and there was this. I was staying in this little kind of guest house there, and an Austrian sociologist who knows quite a lot about Nicaragua, but he hadn't been to this part of Nicaragua before, Jorge Grunberg, and he said to me, he said, "Oh, so what do you think, Karawala? What do you think is really interesting about Karawala?" Karawala, you had these groups of confederacies of sisters who were much more at odds than the equivalents were in Kakabila. This was real warfare between different groups. So I told him that, and he said, "Oh, surely not." And the very next morning, we woke up to a kerfuffle in front of the veranda of two women going at it, and some of them produced a knife, but she was restrained, fortunately, by someone else, and so on. And he said, "I think you're right, you know."
But is this an escalation of levels of violence because of the weaponry?
Yeah. I mean,
introduced?
there've been,
Definitely.
you know, there is now there are murders, some in the last few days that I've heard, not in Kakabila, but in the lagoon, which is the area of only about 10,000 people, and of which Kakabila is one of 12 communities. In the lagoon, there was a murder just a few days ago, and it's, you know, it's 2 murders, in fact, yeah, and yeah.
Whoa,
Not good.
no, it's not.
So
What
before,
do you-
that they were very, very rare. There were fist fights between people, but you never heard of killings at all. And
wow.
now this violence has become, you know, much more serious.
So would you say that the greater, the access to this new source of wealth, these 2 new sources of wealth, has inordinately gone to the men, so therefore there's
Yeah.
pressure towards that kind of pride wealth pattern and patrilocal system because of their basically a great economic group.
Yeah, just one thing there though. I don't think it's really gone to bride wealth. It's going to something different, but we don't really. I'm not really even sure what it is yet. But it doesn't look like bride wealth insofar as that women aren't kind of, or women's labour isn't transacted with any kind of movable goods or anything like that. So it's not like that. But
so the male hat hasn't stabilised enough to be able to create that.
Yeah, either that or it's something that I haven't identified and doesn't look like anything
solidifying language? Is it solidifying marriages to be long? Is it becoming in women's interest to have more permanent marriage bonds in that situation? Or is it likely to? Or
I don't
just
know.
don't know.
I really don't know. It's a really interesting question, and I just don't know. You know.
so there's a
Very
plan
interesting
for
question.
future research.
Yeah, I think
potentially.
so. I mean, I think I've heard a lot of points from
Yeah.
everyone tonight that have made me think about stuff that I haven't thought about before. You know.
No, it's a totally fascinating case study and where it's going to go to in a few years. It's going to be amazing.
Yeah, also because I don't know how much fact there is in it because I haven't really pursued it properly, but I've heard, you know, have you heard of Jeju Island in Korea? Jeju Island. It's this island in Korea where you get these female free divers. So they're women who kind of free dive for seafood. So they dive without oxygen tanks. And they've been doing this. Apparently, this started during either the First or Second World War, maybe the first one, or something like that, at around that time. This is what I hear. But because they started free diving and collecting all this you know, seafood essentially, and then over time that seafood, the value of that has gone up. So the women are bringing in a lot of cash. And I hear, and as a result of that, men are staying home more, and they're doing more childcare, and so it seems like because otherwise they were patrilineal and patrilocal or whatever as the rest of Korea, but now in Jeju Island, I've heard you get these slightly different patterns and also these similar kinds of things because that freediving skills are passed down by women to other women.
That's
and they
really interesting.
Can that be summarised?
Yeah, so it's a place called Jeju Island, Shakti.
Yeah, I'll just spell it here. Yeah,
Okay,
and
put it on the chat.
yeah, but I mean, but the other thing that happened,
Korea, Jeju Island, Korea,
Yeah.
South Korea, North Korea.
Korea, I don't know exactly which part of Korea.
Right.
Oh, South Korea, South.
So the women have traditions of free diving for pearls or what?
No, for various kinds of
Seafood.
seafood. Basically, like seafood at the you know, so things like that very expensive abalone.
Abalone.
And, you know, all sorts of other
Very
things.
cash-rich seafood.
Yeah, but
they're passing the traditions down through daughter, mother to daughter.
well, I don't know about mother to daughter,
coming
but
home
groups of women.
Childcare. They're staying at home doing childcare while the women are doing this. And
I
this-
hear, but I don't know how much truth there is to this, but or to all of it, but also that the women, they dive in groups. So they dive in groups, and I think for some reason the women do seem to be better at diving because you know even when you go diving with a tank, men use up oxygen much faster than women for an oxygen tank. You know, like
So
scuba diving,
Have better, women have better.
Yeah.
It's actually
they might do.
suppressing the anxiety over carbon dioxide.
That's used by aquatic entities. By the
But yeah, I mean, on the northern Mosquito, further north than where I was, they dive for lobster. It's men who dive for lobster, and the lobster have been getting as the sort of low-hanging fruit. In other words, the lobster that is, you know, in the easier to dive areas gets harder to find. They're having to go to areas where they have to dive deeper and deeper, and because there isn't necessarily enough good equipment for decompression, and people having to dive more, that many people have become permanently disabled through, you know, getting what they're known as the bends, you know, also another thing with diving, that men go diving together, and it's produced a whole, in the north, a whole kind of diving culture that's centered on the regional capital of Puerto Cabeza, and men will sell their catches. You know, they'll come off the boats and they'll sell all their catches, or be paid for, if they've been employed by someone, in dollars, or perhaps Cordobas, or they might be paid in cocaine. And then this culture has grown up of men, as soon as they come off the boat, that the women are all in Puerto Cabeza, are all waiting for them to try and intercept them before they get off into taxis in Puerto Cabeza, which is the regional capital, and go off spending their money on all kinds of wine, women, and song, basically, you know. And yeah, that's yeah.
Yes.
So there's a very good, interesting book about women divers, Miskitu divers, which is not in the capital, but in a village much about the same size as Kakabila, called Curi in Honduras, by Laura Hurley. If anyone's interested, she's quite a character, Laura. She's written a rock opera in Miskitu. You can find it online.
It'll be online. Fantastic. Yeah, no, this has been a fantastic, fascinating, there's case studies, fascinating lecture, and all the stories behind it.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much for coming.
And thank you for all your wonderful questions online and in person as well. That's
great.
Really useful, and lots of food for thought as well.
So thank you to everybody on Zoom for coming along. I hope that was really entertaining, and we've got a good recording, I hope, so that it will go out online for more people to see and be appreciated.
Oh, good, because Maisie says she wants
to
no
be
doubt
able
she's
to
gonna
see.
criticize me.
Pickles. Okay, thank you very much. Just to say, next week we have a very interesting talk by Anna Valdivia on artificial intelligence and the supply chain, and the roots of the extraction economy that upholds the artificial intelligence industry. That's a very different subject, but it should be of real interest in political ecology. So I hope you'll be able to come back next week for that, and everybody who's here as well. So I'm going to say goodbye to everyone on Zoom. Thanks for coming. Bye to all, and see you next week.